No one on the 47th floor looked up from their screens. The lights of the server room made the glass walls seem like a deep aquarium green, panels pulsing like fish, amber warnings skittering along the edges. Outside, the corridor smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the city after rain. The mop had traced a steady arc across tile, the fibers catching the fluorescence in a slow, domestic rhythm that did not belong to machines. Elias Carter moved between those two worlds with a practiced modesty. His hands knew the exact pressure to wring out a mop without leaving streaks, the precise angle to tilt a spray bottle so no puddles formed in the seams of the floor. They also remembered how to hold a diagnostic terminal so the glow revealed patterns instead of numbers. Tonight, he treated the server room like any room he was paid to keep. Except, he paused long enough to listen. He didn't just listen to the hum, he counted it. The fans breathed in measured gusts, then hiccuped, as if someone had clipped a conversation mid-sentence. A red cluster blinked, then blinked again a beat later. A metric on the exterior console flared low, then normalized, then dropped like a trainee's hand in a huddle. Elias crouched, mop forgotten against his leg, and read the line like a pulse. It sounded like a timing fault, a discrepancy between two processes meant to step together, a tiny misalignment that had been amplified by an optimization patch months earlier. Atlas was on stage. Ardent Systems had its best clients visiting tomorrow for a live demonstration. The platform represented $300 million, more promises than any single room could hold. The engineers upstairs were exhausted. Marcus Webb had been on the incident for 72 hours already. Sandra Okafor had left messages to sleep but stayed, because Atlas was the kind of machine that kept talking until someone listened. Elias put his palm on the access panel to feel for vibration. There was a faint warmth, a choreography of fans that should have been uniform. He let his thumb follow the rhythm of the blinking LEDs, as if he could steady a heartbeat with touch. He had been an engineer, once led systems at Vantex before paperwork, and a notation on his record turned his life into an arithmetic of two things: paid hours and Lily's bedtime stories. He wiped his palms on his jeans and opened the small tablet he kept in the janitor's locker. It was cracked at the corner and wrapped with clear tape, the kind of improvised repair he knew well. The tablet's monitoring app wasn't sophisticated, but it read logs with an intimacy corporate dashboards ignored. He pulled the last 60 seconds of the scheduler trace and scrolled with a practiced thumb. The timestamps were a hair out. Task handoffs that should align at millisecond precision were drifting by 100th gap, then doubling back into a recursive handoff. The system was compensating, then overcompensating, which caused the fan controllers and cache flushes to start stepping on each other's toes. He could hear Lily in his head, asleep at home with a stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, and he felt the quiet arithmetic of obligation align with the problem at hand. He couldn't fix the core patch from the janitor's closet, but he could do something that would stop the loop from eating itself. Engineers called temporary measures workarounds, managers called them risk, and lawyers called them stop. Elias called the one he thought of a splint, a simple, external counter that steadied the system long enough for a proper repair. He found a spare network switch on the maintenance rackled, unloved, but dependable, and rerouted a diagnostics path through it. The switch introduced a tiny latency buffer, nothing a performance auditor would cheer, but enough to desynchronize the harmful overlap. Like placing a finger over a watering hole to slow a leak. It wasn't elegant. It was not a permanent patch. It was, he told himself, a responsible, temporary measure. When the loop tried its old trick, the buffer absorbed the shock. The red cluster dimmed. The fan's hiccup became a sigh. Metrics rose in a steady, tender slope. Elias sat back on a folding chair with damp knees and let the mop drip into its bucket. He would be leaving soon. The night was long. He tapped a note into the tablet times torso. Anyone reading the logs later could see there had been human hands in the maintenance chain. A security camera caught him. It was a small thing mounted in the corner of the corridor to discourage loitering and unauthorized access to the equipment bays. Its angle flattened his presence to a smear of dark coat and scuffed shoes, the mop handle a requiem staff. The footage continued to record the way office footage always does, dispassionate and stubborn about small truths. Downstairs, Victoria Hale closed a door behind the last of her late meetings and let the hush of the executive suite settle. She had minutes less than that because there were boards to court and investors who expected calm. Her team had briefed her on the Atlas incident, escalation, mitigation measures, client nerves. She studied the incident report with the same attention she gave any other risk measure, numbering the problems into solvable boxes. Then someone forwarded her the camera clip tagged as maintenance anomaly. 47F. She did not expect to be interrupted by domestic motion. The slow, deliberate motion of a mop. The close cropping of a man working where he had no title. But the thing about human footage is not its drama. It's the way it contradicts a tidy narrative. In the clip, Elias crouched and listened to a machine the same way other people listen to music. She heard a fit between two beats that the numeric report had not conveyed. She called the security tech into the room, and he scrubbed back and forth, enlarging the logs alongside the image. Metadata stamped the clip. Timestamps network IDs. The loop suppression event logged at 2 hours 14 minutes and 3 seconds. She watched the way Elias's hands moved. She watched the tiny, improvised Vista-weathered switch become a buffer. She had never been in a server room with a mop. She had, however, been in a boardroom where contempt for the unglamorous had cost the company millions. The footage told a different story than the memo. It suggested competence where the record had suggested something else. Outside the building, the city kept its own rhythms. In a cramped apartment 30 blocks south, Lily Carter folded her small hands over a picture she had drawn of her father's stick figure, mop, a triangle building with windows like tiny eyes. She had insisted on adding a yellow star to the corner. Elias came in with the smell of bleach in his hair and the faint temps of server dust in his clothes. He checked the strap of his daughter's backpack for loose thread and kissed her temple with a weariness that had worn into fondness. "Did you dream about rockets tonight?" he asked, because that was the quiet program of his night's make, a scaffold of normalcy out of bedtime. "Maybe," Lily said. She clutched the rabbit tighter, and for a second Elias saw the man he used to be. Someone who designed networks and expected them to behave like well-trained teams. The middle of his life had been edited into margins and late fees, each line item adding a weight he learned to carry without complaint. He smoothed her hair and listened to the cadence of her breathing until she dozed. Then he dressed for another shift. On the way down, he passed a community center flyer taped to a lamppost. The font had bled in the rain, and he thought of how small administrative things could erode a person. A missed phone call from HR. A notation on a digital ledger that labeled a complex failure as misconduct. They had hung a word on him, and the world rearranged itself around that label. Finding work with a broom had not been a surrender. It had been a plan executed like any other disinsolidity before aesthetics. At Ardent, the monitoring console lit as if in recognition of his presence. He checked in with the night lead, a young engineer named Tomas, who appreciated quiet fixes and quiet people. Tomas handed Elias a stale coffee with the unspoken of all-night projects. "We are all tired, and we are all waiting for the same answer." Elias nodded and ducked back into the server room. The buffer held. The logs trimmed, the feedback spikes. For a while, the building slept. Up on the 33rd, Marcus Webb kept leaning into a whiteboard, full of colored markers and boxers, that looked like a subway map for processes. He had been Audent's chief technical officer for 3 years, a pragmatic man's pragmatist who preferred evidence to rhetoric. Marcus believed in structured escalation, and finger-pointing rarely accomplished anything useful. Still, when an optimization patch began producing emergent behavior that equipment manuals did not anticipate, the room filled with a particular heat, the kind you only feel when something you built starts acting stranger than you thought possible. Sandra Okafor sat at a terminal with her jaw set, her hands a steady machine of their own. Sandra had the authority that comes from having stayed with a difficult codebase and loved it long enough to understand its temper. She had originally paired with Elias at Ardent on a cross-company project 2 years before he left, and their respect had not evaporated with his change in job titles. Her messages pinged. "We're seeing timing drift ganganary optimization layer." She typed, and then stepped back to study the visual. Her eyes narrowed, not in judgment, but in recognition. "Marcus," she said, "this looks like an interplay between the new optimizer and a legacy scheduler." The patch assumes deterministic latency, but the layer below sometimes injects If those microbursts land in the same window the optimizer picks for in-place compaction, you get a feedback cycle. Marcus rubbed his forehead and read the sentence again. Which is a recursive amplification. Sandra finished. It reduces throughput by saturating the response handlers, and then when they retry, they overlap with the next cycle. It's exponential in the wrong place. Marcus flinched, as if she'd nudged a bruise. We rolled that patch last quarter to improve throughput. If we roll it back now, we lose percent terms on the baseline. But if we leave it, every edge case compounds. Outside the door, log entries accumulated like footnotes. Business teams sent messages in tight. Corporate English, escalation, mitigation, carve-outs. Investors wanted to know if the demo would proceed. Inside, a group of people bickered with boundaries and the gentle violence of deadlines. They needed a way to stop the behavior long enough to craft a real fix. Someone in security sent a one-line note with a link. Maintenance footage for 7F might be noise. Tomas had meant it as a courtesy, and as a way to document all hands touching the system. Marcus clicked, expecting to see footage of a contractor who had tripped a cable or a flashing light. He saw a man at elbow height with a mop. Then close up on hands that moved with a specificity that made the hair on his arms stand up. Marcus watched Elias watch a machine and felt the odd humility of being surprised by a person without credentials. Who is that? He asked. Third-party maintenance, Tomas said, voice flat. Name's Elias Carter in the log. Former at Vantex, I think. That name landed in Marcus's mouth like a stone. Vantex had been the company whose collapse 2 years earlier had rewritten a lot of people's resumes. Elias had been one of the engineers who'd been disciplined in that incident. The official record was clean and ugly. An annotation of misconduct tied to a disputed modification. Marcus felt, for a beat, the corporate reflex to close ranks, to read the history and draw conclusions. Sandra, however, widened the clip across a split screen with the timeline of events. The video lined up with the scheduler trace and the blue and orange lines on Marcus's board. The moment the buffer went in, the error rate dipped. It was obvious when expressed visually. Numbers obeyed truth when they could, and the lines told the story without personality. The footage wasn't romance. It was evidence. Elias finished his shift and left with the weathered switch in his shoulder bag because he couldn't, in good conscience, stash it with the trash. He was careful in the way of people who know how fragile normalcy is. He did not imagine that a clipped security note and a late-night clip would reach a CEO's screen. He imagined things in smaller scales. Lily's school permission slip, another utility bill, a list of repairs for the rabbit's ear. Victoria watched the clip twice. The second time, she paused on the moment Elias explained, with a motion that was not theatrical but communicative, the sequence in his fingers. She replayed the timestamps side by side and let the numbers and the image intersect. Then, without preamble, she picked up her phone and scrolled to the number listed in the maintenance log. The log held an entry marked E. Carter contractor on call. She thumbed it. At his apartment, Elias's phone was on the kitchen table alongside a small mound of undone homework and a juice cup. He had a habit of letting it rest face down. It made the night feel like it belonged to his daughter more than any chime. He was bending over Lily's rabbit to sew the torn seam while she watched a cartoon with the kind of concentration only 7-year-olds could muster. When the phone rang an unfamiliar number, he let it vibrate a few times before answering. Elias Carter, he said, voice still threadbare from lack of sleep. Mr. Carter, this is Victoria Hale from Audent Systems. Her voice was as careful as a note under glass calibrated by habit, practiced for the public. I hope I'm not calling it a bad time. He glanced at Lily, who had paused and looked up with one brow raised like an interrogation artist. Elias smoothed the rabbit's ear with his fingers to buy a moment. No, it's okay. How can I help you? Victoria explained brief. Direct that she had seen a clip from the 47th floor and wanted to ask some questions about what he had done. There was no flourish in the invitation. She said, We'd like you to come in and walk us through it. He told her about the buffer, the timestamps, how he'd stabilized the loop. He told her in simple, practical phrases, not because he sought an audience, but because explaining the measure mattered. He wanted them to understand the action and why he had taken it. He wanted, more quietly, to make sure nothing he had done would be used against him for carelessness. On the other end of the line, Victoria noted the way he spoke about responsibility, and something in her registers responded to that. Not sentimentality, but the kind of clarity that made operations possible. For an executive, seeing a person act from obligation rather than performance has an odd constraining beauty. It suggests the company is made of people who will do what must be done. She asked him to come by the office the following morning at 10. He accepted. Before Elias closed his phone, Lily asked, uncertain, "Are you getting a prize, Dottie?" He laughed, not loudly, but with enough light to lift the shape of the night. "Maybe," he said. "We'll see." They went to bed with the kind of small rituals that keep things from fraying. A song, a prayer, a whispered reading of the schedule for tomorrow. Elias dreamed of fan blades moving like pages turning. He woke with the taste of coffee and the memory of green lights staying green. When he arrived at Ardent the next morning, the lobby felt the way large companies always do when something small has the potential to become significant, arranged, alert, and oddly fragile. Security led him through the turnstiles with the same bland courtesy it reserved for everyone who had the misfortune of being important that day. He signed a visitor's log, surrendered a driver's license, and was shown into a conference room that smelled faintly of citrus and new paper. On the screen in the room, the clip he'd made the night before played on loop at the behest of a staffer. Marcus and Sandra were present by invitation. Both looked up with the professional curiosity that had allowed them to live with recurring outages and still come back. At the head of the table, Victoria finished the last of her coffee and folded her hands in a way that suggested she wanted a straightforward account. Elias felt the room compress and expand at once. He had never been comfortable with attention. He was used to being invisible in ways that carried no advantage. When people looked at him, they often read the label his file had carried and made the story fit into that line. Now, he stood in front of data and eyes, and felt the uncomfortable clarity of someone seen on his own merits. "Can you explain what you did?" Victoria asked. Not unkindly. "Walk us through your thought process." Elias drew a breath. He thought of Lily's drawing of a building, the star in the corner, and the way she had expected a father to be steady. He thought, too, of Vantex's meetings that had turned into finger-pointing, of a notation that had become a wall between him and the work he loved. He did not want to make the meeting about him. He wanted to make it about the machine, and about the clients who would have sat through a failed demo and maybe pulled their letters of intent. He began, then, with a metaphor. "Imagine two trains scheduled to pass on the same siding," he said. "If both trains assume the other will wait, they'll both enter and then both try to back up at the same time. The optimizer is like an aggressive timetable change that assumes perfect clocks. But the Leia Balotha legacy scheduler has jitter. The jitter and the optimizer line up sometimes, and when they do, you get overlapping retries. It compacts waste into a moment instead of letting it spread out. My temporary buffer essentially made one train wait a heartbeat, so they don't collide." Sandra nodded, making a note with the quiet authority of someone who has seen the same pattern in 100 places and can now map it onto the present. Marcus listened in the way people listen when their previous assumptions might have to be adjusted. Victoria watched his face and the lines of the whiteboard, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, she allowed herself a very small recalculation. Outside, the building was an orchestration of invisible work. Inside, the room listened. Elias's hands moved over the surface of the table as he explained the data he had seen and the deliberate modesty of his temporary measure. He did not ask for reinstatement, for apologies, or for any grand reversal. He asked only for the truth of the logs and for those in the room to weigh what they had observed against what they had assumed. When he finished, the conference table held a silence that was not the same as deference. It was something more granular, the company measuring whether it wanted to amend the ledger of a human life based on new evidence. Marcus opened his mouth to ask a technical counterpoint. Victoria looked at Helena, her chief of staff, then back at Elias. Considering next steps, with an executive's mind, Verification, corroboration, chain of custody, the security footage, the scheduler trace, the buffer's effect. These were facts that could be checked. They were also facts that had teeth. They would force a review of previous documents where the old Vantex notation was stored. That would not be an overnight process. It would require time, protocol, and a kind of institutional patience corporations rarely boast about but sometimes exercise when the risk calculus changed. Before anyone could outline the administrative list, a junior analyst at the end of the table finished the playback and pointed to a small detail in the clip metadata embedded in the camera frame. It linked the action to a maintenance request with timestamps that matched Elias's report. The chain of evidence folded back on itself like a well-made seam. Victoria reached for her tablet and tapped a calendar entry. "I'd like to set up an extended debrief," she said. "Walk me through the permanent solution you think should be implemented. And we'll run a simulation. Sandra, Marcus, I want you both on the ticket." Elias felt an odd, cautious relief. The room had not promised anything extravagant. It had promised a process. He had always known that truth, unadorned, could only take him so far. It required institutions to translate it into consequence. He sat down and tried to slow his heartbeats. Outside the conference window, the plaza was bright with midday sun. Inside, the pieces were just beginning to move. He had done a thing that protected a demo that represented millions. He had not done it for recognition. He'd done it because someone needed doing. Yet recognition, small, institutional, factual, was seeping through the seams. Victoria slid from her seat for a moment and watched the footage again, this time not as an executive but as someone accustomed to culling risk. The camera frame shrank Elias to motion, but the logs turned that motion into responsibility. She bookmarked the clip and placed it in a folder she labeled Incident Review. It was a bureaucratic gesture. 2 words that meant someone would have to read the record and decide whether past judgments stood. When Elias left the room, he did not immediately know whether the day would yield a job offer, a letter, or nothing at all. He had learned to measure outcomes in smaller units. An invitation to explain, a promise to run simulations, an acknowledgement that his actions had mattered. He took the elevator down alone, the city outside humming and indifferent, and thought of Lily's small star. Back in his apartment that night, Lily's rabbit was patched and propped on the pillow. Elias washed his hands and sat at the tiny kitchen table with the smell of takeout and dish soap as a kind of altar. He reviewed the day's emails with the measured attention of someone who had learned to distrust quick resolutions. There was a note from Marcus. "Need to talk, permanent checkpoint tomorrow, a.m. Also, can you produce your original logs?" There was a calendar invite from Victoria Sim Dema Prep. Juji. He read each line like a ledger and then looked at the video in his head the way the server lights had breathed and then been still. He knew the work ahead would be slow in administrative time. The notation on his Vantex file would not disappear because a buffer had done its job for 3 hours. That would require letters, hearings, statements, perhaps apologies written impersonally. He had spent the last 2 years learning how to inventory patience. At 2 in the morning, the building's heat hissed through the vents, and the city hummed. He sat in the doorway of Lily's room and watched the stars she had drawn. There was a small, domestic kind of faith in that art, a belief that things could stay upright if one held the line. The next morning, before he left, he called his mother. They spoke in measured sentences about the mundane, the neighbor's dog, the inability to get an appointment for the rabbit's ear at the cheap vet. He did not tell her that the CEO had noticed. He did not, yet, have a story to offer. He had a corridor of process ahead of him and the uneasy knowledge that the truth, even when visible, required institutions to move. When he arrived at the office that day, the elevator opened onto a different kind of weather. Marcus had cleared a whiteboard and drawn a simple flow. Primary module optimization, patch timing window, synchronization, checkpoint. The words synchronization, checkpoint sat like an island labeled on a map. They were a placeholder for months of careful coding, simulations, and approvals. They were not a trump card. Elias stood at the marker board and traced the lines with the pad of his finger as if he could feel the logic under the ink. He had ideas about how to anchor the optimizer to the scheduler with deterministic handshakes. ways to force one process to confirm a state before the other preceded small, structural verifications that required careful thought rather than brute force. It would be a measured rebuild. It would be correct by accretion, not miracle. You'll need test harnesses, Sandra told him, the way she told people the truth with hands that did not apologize. We run through thousands of permutations. The problem isn't just one timing window. It's the distribution across loads. We'll simulate. Marcus's voice was steady now that he had enough data to be both curious and accountable. If your approach holds under stress, we'll stage it, roll it to Canary, watch telemetry, and then roll out. Victoria's office had become less of a destination and more of a corridor in the company's process. Her invitation to him had been an administrative nudge, as much as recognition. She did not promise a crown. She promised due diligence. That was the kind of thing Elias knew how to respect. As they mapped tests and authorizations, a junior engineer stepped into the room and held out a thin envelope. It was an interoffice memo, brief and bureaucratic. On the way back down the corridor, Elias opened it with the same casual curiosity he had reserved for instruction manuals. The memo contained a request for a review of his Ventex file and administrative action tagged for the state board that handled professional conduct. It used language that promised process. Reclassification review initiated upon receipt of new evidence. He read it twice because corporate forms could sometimes be a trick of language. This one was not a trick. It meant paperwork, interviews, perhaps a slow unspooling of the notation that had followed him. It meant months, not minutes. It was not a verdict. It was a doorway. Elias folded the memo and placed it in his pocket like a ticket. The day ahead would be technical work, test harnesses, simulations, annotations. It would also be the small human errands that come with being a parent who also happens to be treated as a curiosity at the office. He thought of Lily and the star she had drawn. He thought, too, of the way the building had noticed him and what noticing meant when administered by those with power. In the conference room, Victoria rose from her chair and crossed the floor to the whiteboard. She looked at the map they had drawn and, for a moment, allowed herself a tiny private calculation. How the company would look if it treated quiet competence as data instead of anomaly. Then she turned and did what executives do. She translated possibility into assignment and process. Because people owed institutions the courtesy of being thorough. Run the simulation, she said. Document everything. I want a weekly summary. And Elias, keep the logs tight. We will need every timestamp. He acknowledged the order with a small, unvarnished nod. The room set to work like the parts of a clock aligning. Later, when the team broke to regroup and the monitors dimmed 2 bars of waiting, Marcus pulled Elias aside. Look, he said, voice low, so only Elias would hear. Your name is on some old files. People will bring it up. If you want to say anything, say it to me first. Elias looked at him and appreciated the directness. I'm not here to litigate the past in a theater, he said. I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. I want to teach the system to be safer. Marcus exhaled. Fair enough. As the building transitioned from day to the artificial sunset of office lighting, a message arrived in Elias's inbox. A calendar invite titled Simulation, Synchronization, Checkpoint Trun. The time was set for dawn. He accepted. He typed a short reply to Marcus and Sandra. I'll bring the logs. Before leaving that evening, he stopped by security to request a copy of the camera footage with full metadata. Protocol required a chain of custody. A clip without provenance was useless. Security handed over a USB drive with a neat label. Elias thought of the camera angle and the way it flattened gestures into motion. He thought, too, of how footage could humanize a person for some and incriminate him for others. Back home, Lily had a new drawing. This time of 3 stick figures and a row of windows. She wanted to know if he would be working late again. He told her he would, and she asked if she could come to the office one day to see the big computers. Her curiosity was concrete and wide. It unpretendingly asked for a future in which the world was accessible to a child. Elias tucked her into bed, found the small star she had drawn earlier, and taped it to the refrigerator. The star would catch the light the next morning when he left for the simulation tests, and Lily would notice it in the evening and assume that her father had left some small piece of his day for her to see. It was an adult's ritual of reassurance, made small. He slept poorly and woke earlier than the alarm. The city breathed a little colder than the night before. He rode the elevator up with the USB in his jacket and the memory of Victoria's voice telling him to keep the logs tight. In the lobby, a security guard who had recognized him nodded. There was a subtle shift in how people measured him, not a reversal, but he felt it as a draft of recognition, the kind that does not ask for a story, but rather for more evidence. In the lab, the team set up the harness and began to feed traffic into the simulation. It would not be the public demo. It would be more merciful than that. A controlled stress test. Sensors blinked. Logs streamed. The optimization patch's behavior revealed itself again in miniature slight jitter. Then compounding retries until the checkpoint Elias proposed took effect in the model and steadied the cascade. The telemetry lines smoothed. Sandra circled the dataset and said, quietly, that correlates to the buffer's effect. It holds under load. You could hear a small change in the room. It was not cheering, more like the motor of an engine idling with a relief valve that finally opened. Marcus sent a terse message to Victoria. Initial sim looks positive. Recommend. Canary. Victoria responded with a thumbs up emoji, small. Almost silly, but she had sent an emoji in a professional email before the company learned the value of being brevity and human at once. Elias's stomach tightened when he thought of what could still happen. The test said the theory had legs. It did not, in itself, restore a career. The memo in his pocket had started a process. The simulation had given it direction. There were still people who would read the past and let it determine how they measured him. At lunch, someone from legal dropped by the lab with a list of evidence, requests, statements, timestamps, documentation, linking his actions to mitigation. It read like the paperwork of someone who wanted to be thorough. Elias answered the questions with the quiet of someone used to preparing materials for hearings. His answers were short, precise, and factual. He did not ask for forgiveness. He supplied logs and a narrative tied tightly to the timecodes because he knew institutions could only move on the basis of fact. Victoria watched the simulations from across the glass of her office, and for a moment she allowed herself the small luxury of feeling something like approval, not because a janitor had done a job that someone else should have, but because the company had, in a rare alignment of curiosity and responsibility, noticed competence where it had not expected to. She made a note to schedule a full review of the Vantech sanitation, because good governance meant following evidence even if it made processes uncomfortable. When the lab wound down, Elias walked to the service elevator to head back to the apartment. The day's work had not changed the months of review that lay ahead. The memo in his pocket remained a ticket to a slow process. But there was a subtle, intangible shift. A corridor had opened where previously there had been only walls. Recognition had a bureaucratic grammar now folders. Calendar invites a simulation pass, and that grammar, incremental as it was, meant that the record could be read. As he stepped out into the early evening, a notification chimed on his phone. It was a brief message from Victoria's office. Follow-up meeting, added. Bring logs. Be ready to walk us through the Canary plan. Also, Lily is welcome to visit next week. He stood there a moment, the city around him, indifferent but humming, and looked at the message again. The office's invitation to Lily was small and not intended to console him. It was practical, a sign that the building would allow the personal and professional to overlap in a way the corporate world rarely formalized. For Elias, it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement of the human currencies that had always mattered to him: duty, steadiness, care. He walked the last block home and rehearsed the words he'd use in the meeting. He knew how to talk about timing, windows, and sync. He also knew he would have to explain himself in ways that would not only satisfy the engineers, but also the people who kept minutes and wrote memos. He was ready to be transparent but guarded, as anyone must be when past records could be read as verdict rather than history. When he opened the apartment door, Lily yelled from her room, "Daddy! Are they fixing it?" "They're working on it," he answered, meaning the technical fix and the larger, slower repair of things that happened to people's records. He squeezed her shoulder when he passed. She looked at him with the unexamined faith of the young, that problems could be fixed and that men in suits would sometimes do the right thing. Before bed, he plugged the USB into his personal laptop and skimmed the security footage again. This time, he watched as if cataloging a small artifact of life. He exported the clip to a secure drive and attached a short README chain of custody, captured by 47F corridor cam. Timestamp verified. Note, temporary buffer installed at 2 hours 14 minutes and 3 seconds, measured reduction in error rates over next 4 hours. Contact, Elias Carter. He typed the words carefully and sealed them in an email to Sandra and Marcus. He did not mention the memo yet, though he kept it in his mind like a to-do. He wanted the work to speak for itself, documented in a way that could not be interpreted as impulsive heroism. The night dissolved into a hazy habit of getting up for small reasons: a glass of water, a check on Lily, a look at the city's distant lights. He felt, in a way he could not codify, both small and dangerous. Small, because the work ahead was procedural, and dangerous, because institutional forces sometimes misread evidence and transform corrective action into conflict. When dawn touched the apartment with a thin blue, his phone buzzed with a short text from Victoria's assistant. Victoria would like a one-on-one after the simulation run. 11:30. Her office. He looked at the message, felt the familiar pull at the base of his skull, the old reflex that had made him leave a career once. He steadied himself. He thought of the days when he had designed systems to be resilient, and of the nights he'd mopped corridors in silence. He thought of Lily's star on the fridge, and of the way she would point at it and ask if he had done something important. He put on his coat and left the apartment with the steady, careful steps of someone carrying both a mop and a memory. The building swallowed him up into the rhythm of people going places. The USB in his pocket was a small talisman of evidence. The memo promised a slow reckoning. The simulations were promising, but they were not the end. Victoria watched the simulation reports with a cup of coffee cooling at her elbow. She closed the file and stood, feeling the moderate weight of responsibility. In the quiet interim between a discovery and its consequence, leaders could make choices that either reinforced bureaucracy or allowed justice to follow evidence. She regarded the footage one more time, then picked up her phone, thumbed a note, and prepared to do what the footage demanded: bring a man who had been overlooked into a room where his work and his past would have to be reckoned with. On the schedule, a one-on-one after the simulation run. She wanted to hear how he thought about risk, and she wanted to see the person who had, in a corner of a corridor, steadied a machine that mattered to everyone in that building. Elias met her in the office just after the Canary deployment had shown promising telemetry. The morning light through Victoria's window made the glass faintly blue. Her desk held the same precise stacks of paper and the same single cup of coffee cooling at the edge. She did not make small talk. She had a talent for getting to the heart of an item without ceremony. "You brought the logs," she said. He set the USB in his secure drive on the table like a modest offering. "I did," he replied. He noticed, as he always did, the careful way she listened. Not a corporate courtesy, but an attentiveness practiced by someone whose decisions had weight. "You stabilizing Atlas last night? Probably saved the demo," Victoria went on. "That affects our contracts, our pipeline." She was not praising him so much as noting consequence. "Why didn't you escalate through security or ops when you put the buffer in?" Elias shaded his eyes for a breath and described the night in plain measures. The hiccuping fans, the drift-in timestamps, the small switch on the maintenance rack. He explained how the buffer bought time, a temporary splint to hold the system steady while engineers designed a permanent synchronization checkpoint that would force state confirmations between the optimizer and the scheduler, one process acknowledging the other's state before proceeding. His words were practical. He did not try to transform them into performance. Victoria listened and then asked the question she had carried since the first clip. "Why take the risk yourself?" He answered as he had answered the night Marcus had asked. "Because someone needed to stop the loop. Because there was a kid in my apartment who gets scared by sirens. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was trying to keep a thing from falling apart until someone with authority could fix it properly." There was, in the exchange, an economy of truth that suited both of them. She was an executive trained to parse motives for operational risk. He was a man for whom motive was measured in small domestic units. A repaired rabbit, a backpack with straps that didn't fray. She made a decision that fit her style, quiet and procedural. "We will document everything," she said. "You'll work with Sandra and Marcus on the permanent checkpoint. We'll move to Canary and then staged rollout. And I'm initiating a reclassification review of the Vantex notation. I can't promise outcomes, but I can promise due process." He accepted the promise as something valuable because it acknowledged the procedural grammar that could change a record. Victoria's promise was not a rescue. It was a translation, an action in paperwork and calendar invites that would have to be patient to be real. The work that followed was granular and exacting. Elias embedded with Sandra and Marcus in a lab that smelled of heated silicon and stale coffee. They built the checkpoint as a handshake. One thread would require an explicit acknowledgement token from its counterpart before a state transition could occur. The metaphor they used at the whiteboard kept returning to trains and valve systems with gates that must be opened in sequence. They wrote tests, then more tests. They fed the harness with traffic patterns that mimicked the heaviest client loads and introduced jitter deliberately. Each failure became data rather than drama. Sandra's role was pivotal. She validated the theory, wrote regression tests, and annotated the code with a kind of care that read like a brief biography for the future. "We need to be explicit about back-off policies," she said on the first day they merged prototypes. "If the checkpoint fails, we must ensure retry windows are randomized and bounded. Otherwise, we create system-level contention under load." Marcus, who had first felt the instinct to circle the wagons when Elias's name surfaced, steadily shifted into a collaborator. The evidence had made room for humility. He began to speak in conditional language, proposing stress plans rather than defenses. "If the checkpoint behaves under Canary at 2% traffic for 72 hours with no spike, we can escalate to 5% and involve ops for a staged roll," he suggested. The language was cautious and grown from engineering hygiene. It was the kind of middle ground Elias liked. Systems fixed by protocol rather than applause. Meanwhile, the administrative machinery in the background began its slow, unrushed work. Victoria's office opened the file for review and assigned an investigator from the board that oversaw professional conduct. The review required statements, corroboration, and an audit trail emails, memos, original change requests from Vantex, and the metadata from Ardent Systems. The process was deliberate. It unfolded across weeks of interviews and document requests, and then months of calendar invites and redactions. Elias filed statements. He sat for an online deposition, arranged by counsel, assigned to help with the reclassification inquiry. He answered questions that asked him to map actions to timecodes and to describe intent. The review did not produce instant vindication. It produced more paperwork, which, in its own bureaucratic way, meant movement. Footnotes were added to the old files requests for additional context were sent. The clerkship assigned to Garrett Moss's old accountant account that, when read with the new logs, suggested a pattern of risk decisions authorized without the requisite tests began to attract attention. Garrett had been an architect at Vantex, and his choices, once viewed against the chain of evidence Ardent now supplied, looked less like judicious risk-taking and more like an unsafe shortcut. The discovery process showed that a patch Garrett had endorsed at Vantex had been deployed with insufficient determinist testing, and that his memos emphasized throughput gains without adequately accounting for legacy scheduler jitter. The exposure was procedural rather than melodramatic. Internal memos, timestamps, and vendor emails built a narrative that authorized managers found uncomfortable to ignore. Garrett did not face a theatrical censure. He handed in a resignation that read like an executive's concession, brief, factual, signed with the recognition that the standards for such systems required someone willing to accept the accountability their role demanded. The resignation did not erase past harm, but it cleared a corridor in which institutional responsibility could be reassessed. Atlas's Canary phase rolled forward with the cautious patience of engineers who had seen systems fall when rushed. The checkpoint held. Telemetry graphs, once jagged with exponential spikes, began to show a different grammar. Smooth lines with tolerable variance. The team watched the monitors in sprints and breaks, exhausted and steady. The demo date approached, and the pressure eased not because the world had forgotten how much was at stake, but because the risk footprint had been reduced to manageable terms. When the day arrived, the public demonstration was quiet in its drama. There were no ceremonial speeches about the janitor termed engineer. There were only slides, well-timed load tests, and a dashboard that stayed green through the heavy phases of the run. Clients who had been jittery sent terse messages of praise in corporate English. Some signed letters of intent in the days after, not because a single man had saved them, but because the systems that supported their workflows had been shown to be steadier than before. Recognition, when it came, took the form it often does in institutions. An offer written in measured terms. Victoria asked Elias if he would consider a role on the reliability team, a formal position that would allow him to work on preventative controls and to build test harnesses that kept systems honest. There was a salary attached, benefits that included professional indemnity, and, perhaps most importantly for him, access to the meeting room where decisions about code and process were made. He did not accept immediately. He wanted to know how the reclassification process would proceed, and whether the company would support him publicly in a way that wouldn't simply reframe old stigma into a new badge. Victoria arranged for counsel and HR to coordinate with the state board's investigator to ensure transparency. The reclassification process, run by the board, moved at its own pace. There were hearings where both Vantex and Ardent provided documentation. There were periods of waiting. There were moments of fear when the old notation seemed to linger like an echo in someone else's email. There were also small, affirmative signs. A colleague who vouched in a statement, a manager who annotated a memo with dates that contradicted prior assumptions, a vendor who confirmed that Garrett's approval notes had been out of step with the testing required. Through it all, Elias kept his posture modest. He described his work rather than his worth. He wanted a corrected record because his daughter deserved a father whose professional standing matched his competence, not for vanity, but because career penalties had real economic effects: higher rent, fewer opportunities, and the quiet weight of being read as a risk rather than a resource. He wanted institutions to read evidence the way engineers read telemetry, dispassionately and obedient to the numbers. When the board finally issued its reclassification recommendation, it did so with the patient language of bureaucracy. The notation of misconduct would be reclassified as action based on incomplete evidence. Override, a phrase that removed the moral censure implied by misconduct and replaced it with a technical correction. The change did not make headlines. It was a document in a file, stamped and signed, and then scanned into a record that allowed Elias to submit a clean resume for positions that had previously been closed to him. The months of slow work yielded another practical consequence, a letter bearing Victoria's name and the company's letterhead, stating the facts of his intervention, the chain of custody for the footage, and the role he had played in averting a system failure. It was not a public proclamation. It was an institutional record that could be used in employment contexts and licensing boards. That letter mattered as much as any handshake. It was, in a dry but real way, a restoration. In the days after the reclassification, life returned to its modest rhythms. Elias continued to go to work now with a badge that allowed him through the morning turnstile and to the small domestic rituals that anchored him at night. He worked with Sandra and Marcus on further resilience features, and together they wrote the post-mortem that would become a reference for on-call teams. He trained new maintenance staff on the importance of clear change requests and chain of custody for ad hoc interventions. He became a responsible node in the system he had once been kept from. There were no there were, instead, small human gestures that felt like acknowledgement. A cup of coffee left on the lab bench with a sticky note that read thanks. A junior engineer who asked Elias to review a script. An intern who wanted to know how to read scheduler traits. These were not theatrical rewards. They were the slow accretion of respect. Victoria, who had remained professionally reserved through the process, showed a human moment when Lily visited the office one weekday afternoon. An invitation arranged, not as a media stunt, but as courtesy, to a man whose child had watched her father care for his world. Lily arrived in a small jacket and a backpack with a star drawn on it. She clutched the rabbit with the patched ear, and looked around at racks of gear that to her were a forest of blinking lights. Victoria met them in the reception area. She crouched to Lily's level and spoke with a gentleness that surprised the receptionist who peeked through a curtain. "Are you the artist?" she asked, pointing to the star on Lily's backpack. Lily nodded solemnly. "My daddy fixed the lights," she announced, which in the child's economy of facts was both truthful and sufficient. Victoria smiled without converting the moment into a company narrative. She reached into her desk and took out a small pen and emblem of Ardent Systems used rarely for internal recognition and handed it to Lily. "The one who starred her daddy?" she said, quietly. It was a small gesture with no press release attached, and that made it all the more human. Elias watched them together and felt, in a place that was not dramatic but steady, a sense of structural rightness returned to him. The pin and the office visit did not change his life overnight. They simply inserted his family into the archive of his work in a way that felt like translation. The office, for its part, did what offices do. It absorbed the event into policy. Training modules were updated to ensure any maintenance intervention had clear documentation and a handover process. Security's camera logs were given procedural respect rather than used as a source for gossip. Sandra and Marcus wrote a paper for an internal synthesis of the incident that would help other teams learn from the design lesson. Optimistic optimizers must be reconciled with jittering legacy schedulers through explicit sync. Gerritto. Moss's resignation left a vacancy that the company filled after a search that emphasized candidate history of careful tests and explicit back-off policies. The company also established a small fund to assist contractors who encountered career-affecting incidents while acting in good faith during emergencies, an institutional nod toward holding organizations accountable for the conditions in which people work. Elias accepted the offer to join the reliability team after a short period of consideration. The position fit the part of him that wanted to teach systems how not to fail and to mentor technicians, so the maintenance crew could write interventions that were less improvisational. The role came with a predictable schedule and, importantly, with the time to be home for Lily's bedtime on most nights. He did not see the appointment as triumph. He saw it as a return to a kind of professional life that had been interrupted. He arrived at his first day with the same careful shoes he'd always worn and a quiet intention to do the work well. The public demo that followed months later was unremarkable in the best sense. The feed held steady, the dashboard stayed green, and the clients who had hovered at the edge of commitment provided the longed-for letters of intent. The celebration was administrative round of emails, a plaque for the team in the corridor, cake at the engineer's bench. Elias stood with the people who had asked tough questions and written the tests. They exchanged tired smiles. There was no confetti, no sensational reveal, just a room of professionals who had made a system work as it ought to. On a Tuesday evening, several months after that first night, Elias rode the elevator down with Lily perched on his hip, her small legs wrapped around his waist. The ground floor monitor flashed a rolling status of Atlas, operational, 99.98% sustained. The green was deep and steady. He felt the color in his chest as if it were a small ledger balance. Victoria watched him in the lobby as she sometimes watched people whose trajectories intersected with hers. She caught his eye and offered a brief nod in executive's acknowledgement that it had not been about one person, but about what good governance could do when it paid attention to evidence. She did not make a scene. She had, however, done the work and used the instruments of her office to allow the system of the company to reflect what the data suggested. Elias thought of Lily's star taped to his refrigerator and of the way the months of tedious process had remade a space where he could apply for things without prejudice. He thought, too, of the thin seam between being seen and remaining invisible. The footage of the mop motion had not been heroic so much as factual. It had been a moment of attention lent by a machine and followed by action lent by an executive. That combination d'état and due process felt like a kind of quiet justice. They walked out into the evening air, and the city exhaled around them. Lily yawned and asked if they could get pancakes tomorrow. He said yes. She looked up at him with a trust so unadorned it was almost preposterous in its simplicity. "Will you always fix the lights?" when they go red?" she asked. He smiled, because the question was both literal and the kind of larger vow children make of the small, steady acts of adults. "I'll try," he answered, "and I'll make sure the people who own the building fix the pipes so the lights don't get sick again." They caught a taxi, and on the way home the city blurred. The day's specifics were less important than the weight of a life settling back into its designed contours. Elias had his job, his letters, his corrected record, and the slow restoration of a professional identity that matched his competence. He also had Lily, who would grow up with the knowledge that her father was not defined by a single notation in a file, but by a pattern of care and responsibility. The story of the 47th floor did not become legend. It became a case study and then a footnote in the company's ongoing work to make Atlas resilient. It became a reminder that institutions do, sometimes, act on evidence rather than impression. For Elias, it meant the quiet satisfaction of structural integrity restored, that the system recognized what a person had done and allowed the record to reflect it. On a late afternoon, when the office corridors had a softness of light and the monitors hummed a lullabial rhythm, Elias walked past the server room and paused. The panels flashed green. He stood for a moment and read the status like he once read the pulse of a sick machine. It was steady. He thought of the mop head, the switch, the tiny buffer that had bought time for a proper solution. He thought of Lily's star and of Victoria's efficient, human decision. He stepped into the elevator, and when the doors closed, he carried with him a sense of being recognized that was not theatrical, just a practical alignment between competence and consequence. If anyone asked later what had happened, the answer would be a mixture of numbers and small gestures. A timing fault amplified by an optimizer. A temporary buffer installed by a man who had not asked for credit. A CEO who watched footage. A team that wrote tests. And months of quiet, procedural work that corrected a notation and restored his standing. The moral of the story, if there had to be one, was less about rescue and more about attention. Who notices whom? And what institutions do when they choose to act on new evidence. Elias put his key in the door that evening and found Lily asleep with the rabbit tucked to her chin. He set down his bag, smoothed the blanket, and looked at the small star on the fridge. He did not feel triumphant. He felt, in the clean, steady way of earned things, whole. If this story reminded you to notice the quiet competence around you, share it with someone who needs that reminder. And subscribe for more stories about the people behind the work that holds the modern world.